Mr. Hirai.
Well, thank you very much for your kind introduction, Chairman Dr. Roderick. So I'm Hirohito Hirai, DG of the Economic and Industrial Policy Bureau of the METI in Japan. And it is my great honor to have a chance to participate in today's seminar together with so much influential and renowned scholars. Moreover, it is a wonderful event for us to discuss over industrial policy, on which we have spent so much time and energy since I took this position last July in order to reformulate a set of our existing industrial policies, which we call the new direction. Since I am instructed to use just 10 minutes for my presentation, I can only briefly touch upon the basic concept and some examples of this new direction. But I'm looking forward to hearing comments, either positive or bitterly negative, from the distinguished guests of today's seminar. Well, so let me start from some introduction of the background of our discussion. Our policy discussion has started with the global way of recognition of the role of industrial policy. As Dr. Matsukato highlighted the importance of the role of public sector in innovation, not a few scholars are paying so much attention to industrial policy nowadays. I assume the background of this current trend is threefold. First, COVID-19 has expanded government roles for economic recovery, especially given that the global supply chain has been totally disrupted. Also, significant externalities of capitalism have been realized, such as climate change and economic disparity. Furthermore, challenges or rivalry against capitalism, such as authoritarianism, have emerged in the world. Many people in democratic countries believe that capitalism must be updated in order to show that it is able to serve as a system to overcome social issues and thereby improve its legitimacy. Given these backgrounds, major economies have started, or at least have been considering, large-scale and long-term industrial policies when we started our discussion in 2021. Japan's government-wide response toward this background is so-called New Capitalism, with a strong initiative taken by Prime Minister Kishida. This aims to overcome market failures of capitalism while utilizing and benefiting from market mechanisms. The aim is to create a virtuous cycle between economic growth and wealth distribution. METI's role in this concept is to involve firms, startups, investors, and other economic agents to achieve both strong growth and fair distribution. The new direction of economic and industrial policy that we have been discussing is indispensable to achieve this new capitalism. The basic concept of the new direction of economic and industrial policy is to expand both public and private investment toward the resolving social issues and achieving economic growth. Through our discussion, we reflected upon Japan's period of low economic growth, which we call the lost 30 years. One of the conclusions we reached was that through this period, Japan has underinvested in the fields that were truly necessary, such as green technology, digital technology, and human capital. To induce private investment in these fields, the government will take a mission-oriented approach in target areas and provide large-scale, long-term, and well-planned support. The goal of our mission-oriented policies is to resolve socio-economic issues while achieving economic growth, or vice versa, to achieve economic growth by means of providing socio-economic issues solution services. For this purpose, we have identified areas that we should focus on. Based on the necessity of problem solving in Japan, the necessity of problem solving in the world, and the possibility plus capability of Japan's contribution in these fields. When implementing this mission-oriented approach, we strongly feel the necessity of reform Japan's traditional industrial and socio-economic structure. The new direction includes globalization of Japanese companies, value creation rather than cost reduction, and involving startups and not merely depending on traditional large corporations. This slide summarizes the action items under the new direction. For mission-oriented industrial policies, we have identified 6 fields where the government and private sector will share a long-term vision, and the government will provide large-scale, long-term, and well-planned support to induce private investment. At the same time, the new direction aims to update Japan's socio-economic system to adapt to the current industrial structure and to improve global competitiveness. Let me give you some examples of mission-oriented industrial policies that we have already started its implementation. Corresponding to achieving a carbon neutral society, we have established the Green Innovation Fund in 2021. This is a large-scale fund with $15 billion, which is unprecedented in Japan, to support programs with ambitious carbon neutral goals. Support is provided for long-term for up to 10 years. Supported programs must be undertaken with a company's strong commitment, which enables sharing a future vision between government and private companies. For realizing a digital society, the government has supported Japan advanced semiconductor manufacturing in 2021, which is a joint venture by TSMC in Taiwan, Sony and Denso in Japan to produce semiconductors. This project aims to not only fortify our domestic manufacturing base, but also to enhance industry, academia, government collaboration, and foster human resources in the semiconductor-related field. I would like to introduce an example of the social second pillar, updating our socio-economic system at the end of my presentation. This is human capital investment. We have shedding light on the issue of low and declining investment in human capital in Japan, which in our analysis has been one of the main reasons for low labor productivity growth and slow adaptation to the rapidly changing industrial structure. To overcome this issue and foster human capital that could adapt to the current and future situations, we have to start overall restructure of our labor systems as well as the education system. We will promote human capital management in companies, improve flexibility or liquidity of the labor market, and revisit our way of education from elementary school level up to PhD education level. That concludes my presentation, and thank you for your attention. I look forward to taking any questions or comments in a later discussion.
Thank you, Mr. Hirai, for packing so much into a limited amount of time. Let's move on to Ms. Leong.
Hi, I'm just going to see if I can share my screen. Hang on. Right, hopefully you can all see that now.
Yes, we can.
Okay, so as the introduction says, I am the Director for Analysis. I'm at the Department for Business, Energy, Industrial Strategy, and I'm very pleased to be here among such an illustrious company to talk about UK industrial policy. And I'm very struck, I think, from the initial discussions about what some of the similarities and parallels are in terms of both the history of UK industrial policy and where we are thinking about going in terms of the future. In terms of the starting point for thinking about the UK, it is our relatively weak productivity performance. We have a long-standing productivity gap for France, Germany, and the USA, and we've also had a much more severe productivity slowdown than other G7 countries. And I think the Bank of England's recent historical series suggested that we had just had the worst decade of productivity growth for nearly 200 years. So that's obviously been something which the successive UK governments have been concerned with, and that has led to a series of policy initiatives over the past 20 years. But while these have certainly had a really positive impact on business environment, on skills and innovation, we've seen, in particular, I think private investment continue to be consistently within the bottom quartile of the OECD. So overall, I think what we would see is some productivity catch up over the 1990s and early 2000s, but since the late 2000s, progress has gone into reverse. And I think the conclusion has been that while horizontal policies are necessary, they are not always sufficient in order to drive increased productivity growth. And in particular, I think the focus that perhaps Stigler's alluded to about that worry about picking winners has certainly led to that focus within the UK. And looking forward, identify perhaps a greater need to identify not just on the what, but also who in particular sectors, the institutions that we have in place, and why we've been establishing some very successful macroeconomic policy institutions, most notably the Bank of England and the OBR. Certainly on the microeconomic front, we've probably been less successful. And I think finally, and something here I think we have in common with us, is that question about where, and in particular that focus on place, and the importance of place, and indeed the history of a place in terms of thinking about productivity, local productivity performance. So how has the UK's approach changed? So first of all, starting off with what I might call sectoral policy. Here, the recent plan for growth looked at a number of different factors here, both future growth potential, our strategic government objectives, in particular, I think net zero and levelling up, but also I think where can government generally make a difference in terms of where are their market failures, where are their missing markets, and I think the other factor here mentioned internet industries, where we have new markets. And what that has led us to think about is identifying sectors like, for example, digital, life sciences, green economy, and the creative industries as priorities. But I think there's still an issue, I think, about perhaps some of those larger employment service-oriented sectors such as retail, logistics, and hospitality. And I think the experience of COVID has suggested the importance of not forgetting about those particular sectors of the economy. In terms of the how, we've got some important institutional microeconomic policy institutions, particularly the National Infrastructure Commission and the Productivity Institute, but also the recent levelling up strategy focused on improving institutions making place-based policy decisions at both the national and the local level. Just turning to the focus on levelling up, hopefully this isn't necessarily new to a lot of you, but I think that focus on not just physical capital, but also thinking about other forms of capital, in particular social institutional capital as well, and that link between those institutional factors and how local decisions are made, in terms of thinking about how the overall system works to influence outcomes within regions, and even I think even within cities and towns. I think noting that some of these issues are what we would call hyperlocal, very much concentrated on very small areas. And London is a classic example, with very highly productive areas, cheek by jowl as it were, with very low areas of productivity. So what are the challenges for the future? So I think the question is really, what does the economy look like post the pandemic, and what will the new normal look like? So, and here I've identified two particular things to think about. One is the shift towards hybrid working and the impact that has around both, how we think about cities and how we think about where people live and work. What do we think about the impacts of, for example, agglomeration when the travel to work area becomes virtual rather than physical? And also, I think the other issue of COVID-19 alongside the Russia-Ukraine crisis has focused our attention on supply chain resilience, and in particular thinking about the impact of private decisions on risk versus efficiency versus the implication for the wider public. We spoke before about path dependency, and there's some really good examples here. I think one, a study by Rice and Venables, noting that the impacts of industrial changes in the 1970s have had lasting effects upon development in places. I think they identified one town as a exception. That's that dot, if anyone can see on the slides, off to the left, which is Corby, where there was a massive investment. But on the whole, I think what this shows is that the changes here, and here it is male employment rates, are very much correlated now in the decade to 2011 with where they were in the 1970s. The other chart here looks at the example of a major investment, which in this case is Hinkley Point, thinking about where were the vacancies and really why there were localized impacts on the investment at Hinkley Point. You can also see that the location of what we might call higher value jobs, software design, finance management, we're still skewed towards the larger regional centres, London and Bristol. So what does that make us think about the future? I think what that tells us, is that, first of all, if we are going to make a difference in terms of looking at those areas where large structural change is required, policy needs to move more quickly. Otherwise, it can be quite difficult and expensive to make a change. And we do have some examples where that approach has been a success. In particular, I think the examples identified here are the switch to natural gas, the digital switchover. But I think we can see that there are some big challenges on the future, and be interested to hear discussants' views on these. In particular, I think the impact of automation, the ongoing impact of digital, and the challenge of reaching net zero. So that's the end of my presentation.
Thank you very much, Ms. Leong. I should mention that we're hoping to have some general discussion and questions from all the participants. So if you have any questions or comments, I'd encourage you to put them on the chat box, and I'll try to relay them as time permits. But let's first move on to our discussants. We'll have first Gordon Hansen from Harvard, followed by Chuck Sable from Columbia. And they'll each have 5 to 7 minutes to reflect on what they just heard. Gordon?
Thanks very much, Danny, and thanks also to Ufuk for inviting me to participate today. This is an exciting conference about an absolutely fundamental set of issues that many economies are confronting. And it's also kind of an important moment of reckoning for the economics profession as we realize, one, our opposition to sets of policies that are fundamental for addressing the deep challenges that we face as society, and two, try and acquire some much needed humility as we think about effective policy design and implementation. I'd like to thank Mr. Hirai and Ms. Leong for their kind of penetrating, cogent presentations, which characterize the broader objectives of industrial policy, first in the Japanese and then in the UK context, and then thinking carefully and thoughtfully about how one goes about designing and implementing such policies. I want to make two brief points in my few minutes. First is to think about the purpose of industrial policy and what I learned from their two presentations in that dimension. And second, thinking about what we know about the successful implementation of industrial policy. So on the purpose, the starting point here is what, for me, is what Joe Stiglitz said about the importance of defining social objectives. When it comes to industrial policy, one source of concern is the sense from national policymakers or national political leaders is that industrial policy can be all things to all people, that a single policy is going to be successful in enhancing prospects for economic growth, reducing the carbon content of consumption and production, and reducing economic disparities. If we think about what Mr. Hirai mentioned in terms of the externalities of capitalism, and we think about what Ms. Leong said about the importance of the who, the where, and the how of industrial policy, I think it becomes apparent pretty quickly that you can't have a single policy which is going to accomplish all of those objectives. In the UK context, one thing that for me is a source of concern is that we keep promoting the idea that we're going to decarbonize the economy at the same time that we reduce economic disparities. And we end up hijacking industrial policy to achieve objective 1 without thinking enough about how we achieve objective 2. So to operationalize that, think about the components of industrial policy that both Mr. Ryan and Ms. Leong outlined. And here I'm going to change some terminology a bit to fit into kind of what we see in the US context. And those policies had 4 components. One is some form of workforce development. The second is technical assistance to firms of some kind. The third will be, and this was implicit, I think, in their analyses, tax incentives of some kind to firms. And the fourth will be the development of necessary infrastructure. The combination of those 4 elements is going to vary enormously whether our objective is advancing innovation or achieving decarbonization or trying to reduce persistent disparities in society that Ms. Leong kind of mentioned at the end, and thinking about the persistent effects of causes of unemployment in the UK. So think, just as an example, think about workforce development. If our objective is to promote economic growth, then the focus is going to be on STEM training. It's going to be on engineers, and it's going to be with a focus of trying to get more people into advanced degrees. If it's decarbonization, it's a much narrower part of STEM, where we're thinking about improving technology for battery storage and the manufacture of photovoltaic materials. When it comes to economic disparities, however, we aren't talking about the frontiers of training and education. We're talking about what folks in the middle of the earnings distribution need, and that's typically vocational and technical training, and that will occur in large part in non-4-year college institutions. So as we move now to design and implementation, recognizing that we need separate, hopefully complementary policies to achieve these objectives is extremely important. We need to keep reminding politicians at the national level, and that you can't be all things to all people in setting forth industrial policy. So second, when it comes to implementation, there is some notion of a common supply chain for creating industrial policy in many high-income countries that involves combinations of national level policymakers and academics. First, sort of recognizing the problem. Second, designing the theory and testing that theory using observational data of some kind. Third, then implementing that policy typically through national level institutions. And fourth, then just evaluating what happens in the end. If you think about some of the essential actors in this process, which includes firms, workers, and civic actors, they don't really show up until the end. If we think, though, about what's happened in the practice of economic development in developing countries, what we see is a supply chain that looks pretty different. And something that Danny and I have come to appreciate in work we're doing on that touches on place-based policies and industrial policies in the US contexts is that the practice of economic development in the US has begun to look a lot like the practice of economic development in emerging economies, at least when it's done on the ground by local actors. And what that means is that successful policy is going to involve NGOs and civic actors, industry groups, and local policymakers much earlier in the supply chain. And so an effective industrial policy then likely means bringing civil society in to the recognition of the problem and into the process of developing the approaches that we're going to implement. So to ground this concretely, think about workforce development. The provision of workforce development is going to be through existing educational institutions. In the US, if you think about the vocational and technical training that we need to help reduce economic disparities, that's not happening in elite universities. It's happening in community colleges. It's happening in regional public universities. And so successful workforce development has got to start from the local context at the get-go. Those institutions will look different in Japan and will look different in the UK. And so that mindfulness of local context is really important. So with that, I'll close and would love to hear more from Mr. Bry and Ms. Leong about the practice of industrial policy in their context, which local actors are involved with Ms. Leong's who, where, and how, as we think about coming from kind of high theory to figuring out how we do these things successfully to achieve specific objectives in practice. Thanks very much.
Thank you, Gordon. I will give the presenters a chance to respond. So, but before I do that, let's hear from our second discussant, Chuck Sable.
Hi, it's a pleasure to be here. And apologies for the screen. I'm very nearsighted, and in order to see you, I shoved my face in the screen and produced a result that you don't want to see when I'm speaking. So here I am, and I'm going to echo a lot of what Gordon said. I think this is it's an important moment because decades-long barriers, ideological dispositions against industrial policy have really disappeared. Countries are committing to spend substantial amounts of money on industrial policy, the kind of industrial policies they would have repudiated only a few years ago. And the concern is not that they'll be impeded by their old ideological commitments, but that they actually are undertaking things that they don't know yet fully how to do. Now, it is true, as Joe Stiglitz said, that there have always been industrial policies and many have been successful, but it's also true that a lot of those industrial policies had to do with technological initiatives that could be managed by relatively small groups of firms and technical experts, academics, scientists, at the very apex of the advanced countries, DARPA being the obvious example and model. And diffusion to firms was, again, relatively straightforward because the key actors were themselves highly sophisticated organizations. Many of the things that are now rightly being understood as industrial policy having to do with the green transition, having to do with addressing the effects of accumulated poverty, as in the Leveling Up program, are in contrast place-based. They only will succeed if local actors can adapt general ideas to their circumstances, and just as important, if local actors can learn in many cases, can learn a set of competences, ability to coordinate with each other, with national, regional and national organizations that they're not accustomed to doing. And those local actors can refer to firms doing new things as much as workers acquiring new skills, local governments doing new kinds of planning, both to facilitate development, to facilitate a green transition, and to be more inclusive. These are enormous demands, and even supposing, which I don't fully, but that we had somehow automatically accumulated the tacit knowledge needed to do the kinds of policies that are going to be required at the top to finish producing green steel, to go to green concrete, diffuse e-vehicles, even assuming that we had more fully mastered those things than we have, we would be faced with the challenge that Gordon posed, and which is implicit in the very idea of Donald Young's leveling up, in the British government's program of leveling up, which is, again, a program of inclusion, broad-based economic development, necessarily contextualized, and it is common to both the advanced countries, Danny and Gordon were saying, and to developing countries. So I think that what makes this moment perhaps dangerously unique is that very substantial governments, political parties, societies are placing a bet on something that they had regarded as for confused reasons as too dangerous to do. They're doing it for very good reasons. It has to succeed. And the challenge is figuring out how to make it succeed as we undertake it. If you look under the hood at the next generation EU, I'm afraid to say this, at the concrete plans for leveling up, at the green transition or what's left of it in the United States, you find that the road ends just at the point where it starts to incline and a bridge needs to be built towards a more localized, place-based, participatory future that we need, but and whose general principles we understand, but we have to invent as we're building.
Thank you, Chuck. So I will turn back to Mr. Hirai and Ms. Leong to give us some thoughts on these reflections. As I heard them, there are lots of questions, but the one that sort of stick with me is one question about whether we have the mapping between the objectives and the instruments right, that we have many objectives, from the green transition to inclusion to fostering the digital economy and resilience of supply chains. And the question of whether we need to think about each one of these separately and with different kinds of instruments. And the other issue, which both discussants brought up, is maybe I'll put it in the form of too much of the discussion seems to be in the form of sort of top-down instruments, which is sort of very much like an old-style industrial policy. I think one thing that we've learned is that we need sort of more bottom-up, both learning about what's happening up, at the local level, as well as including local actors much earlier in the process of the development of these policies. So, but and one question that Joe Stiglitz asked in the chat box that I'll just also raise, the World Trade Organization has not been mentioned. Do you see the WTO and its disciplines in any way as a constraint on any of this? So with that, Mr. Hirai?
So thank you for the questions. And then, let me start with the so much objectives I mentioned in this new direction. So we have pointed out the 6 objectives, 6 missions we are calling, and implementing our new set of the industry policy. They are totally different from each other. And then they are all those socioeconomic problems we have to resolve, we have to solve, not only in Japanese-wide, but also worldwide. And then I believe the rationale to implement that kind of industry policy is because if there is such a big needs there should be a big market there. And if we can solve that kind of the problems by providing our new products or new services, then that would make us a good chance to achieve economic growth. So that is the things we are in mind. So that is the first things I would like to comment on. And another answers to the questions, which is very difficult for me to answer. So we believe such a multinational mechanism of the World Trade Organization is critically important for us to have a better trading system. So we believe in such a World Trade peaceful dispute mechanism, or in order to solve that kind of disputes, we need a set of the rules. So we still believing in that some trade rules and disputing settlement mechanism, even though the current WTO system is not working. So we have to make it as another alternative somehow. But I'm sorry, I'm not genius to say this is the alternative. But somehow, even though we cannot have such a good multinational mechanism, but we may seek another form of maybe say plurilateral trade set of the trade rules or dispute mechanism, or maybe the bunch of the bilateral trade rules and dispute mechanism could replace those multilateral mechanisms. So we have to, anyway, to make every effort to have kind of those mechanisms replacing the current WTO multilateral trading system. That is the belief, and that I'm not sorry. That is the good answer to your question, but my comment is that.
Thank you, Ms. Leong.
Right. Yes, I thought there's a lot in those comments, and thank you, Danny, for summing them up. I think quite succinctly. I think I'm not going to comment on the WTO, not least because we are the Department for Business and not the Department for Trade. But I think there is obviously thought within the UK around how do we use our newly formed ability to negotiate free trade agreements to seek opportunities for the UK economy, as well as I think thinking about perhaps those wider ambitions, for example, on climate change. On objectives, I think there's sort of a question there, isn't there, around we were in setting out those objectives. Are we recognising all the trade-offs that are there? I think the argument here around what those potential trade-offs on has certainly moved on from when I was very much a junior analyst, and seeking very much the assignment of one lever to one policy objective, and another macro was for macroeconomics, micro policy for distribution, and never the twain shall meet. And I think now we are looking for cases where perhaps we can see perhaps self-reinforcing issues. I think Hirai mentioned innovation, the green economy. If we are to perhaps escape perhaps some of the more obvious negative trade-offs, the answer will lie in innovation. And where does that come from? I think that is a question for the whole economy as it seeks to alleviate the effects of climate change. I think the last comment was on the issue around local actors, and I think correctly identified that that's something that's obviously at the heart of the levelling up strategy. It's very much about recognising that the local economy is an ecosystem that relies upon very much upon local decision makers, and it's not necessarily a new thing for the UK, but it is almost like a rediscovery, I think, of the necessity of ensuring that local decision makers take decisions that are appropriate for local areas. And I guess the question is also, what is the right level at which that decision making can be devolved for? And that is obviously a broader question for the UK as well.
Thank you. We do have miraculously 2 more minutes left. And I wonder if I can ask another question that I believe Joe Stiglitz posed in the chat box on sort of the relative emphasis on place-based versus people based, or one might have said sort of sector or industry based policies. And as that changing in your view of as you think about industrial policies today? So very briefly, maybe Ms. Leong first.
I think that the levelling up strategy is a recognition that the two are intertwined. That is, what we've seen, for example, gentrification is if an area attracts new investment, whether that's, development of a new underground or rail line, it is not a solution to simply see the population of that area turn over and be replaced by more highly skilled workers, and for those more low skilled workers to end up moving out. That of itself, I don't think, delivers, the government's objectives from levelling up. So I think the short answer is I think we're recognising that it is not right to focus on one or the other, but to recognise that both are important.
Thank you. Did you want, Mr. Hirai, would you want to add something on this?
So the answer from me is, maybe the question to the answer is yes and no. Yes, maybe we are not focusing on the industry in the conventional way of using the terms. So we are now focusing on, say, such a heavy industry or light industry or whatsoever. So but still, we would like to still put an emphasis on the new set of the industry, like green transformation industry is a kind of group we expect them to achieve a new set of the solution for that the socioeconomic matters. So like in this, to make a resilient society, we would like to form a new industry group like resilient industries. So in that sense, we are still focusing on the industry group, but the way of using term is totally different what we use the term of the industry group, or that is maybe the answer to your question.
Thank you. No, that's very, very helpful. Let me thank all the speakers for this session, and let me turn now over to the chair of the next session, Mr. Watanabe.
Thank you, Professor Roderick. We're going to enter session 2. In our session, we'd like to discuss based on the presentation from academic researchers. And in this session, we have 2 speakers, Dr. Austin Goolsbee, professor of the University of Chicago, and also we have Dr. Josh Rana, professor, Harvard University. We also have as a discussant, Dr. Tomura Eiichi, professor of Hitotsubashi University, and Dr. Tomura is also a faculty fellow of RIETI. And we also have a discussant from the government policy makers, Dr. Philip Steinbeck, Director General of the Economic Policy Department, Federal Ministry of Economy Affairs and Climate Action in Germany. Now, first, we would like to listen to Professor Austin Goolsbee.
Okay, thank you. I hope you can hear me. What a fun and important topic that we meet today to discuss. In a way, it's the perfect introduction, what we've already seen. The Stiglitz observation that all policy is industrial policy, because everything we do influences the economy and the directions of what industries succeed or fail. And the Roderick imperative or description, which I think is totally accurate, of the first generation of industrial policy, economists basically don't like it for fear that it will be captured or for fear that it will fail, because the information of the policymakers is so limited that they will choose things that end up not working. And then the last session basically says, well, this is not your grandpa's industrial policy. We're doing it now. And the new generation of industrial policy is really hopefully about fixing externalities and addressing market failures in a way that maybe other policy won't work. I guess I would like to just make 2 points. And one is about what that new industrial policy is looking like. And the other is kind of the ghost of grandpa's industrial policy still hangs over us. And I think the challenge for the new industrial policy is going to be trying to avoid those same regulatory capture-like concerns and information-based failure concerns. So point 1 is about that the new industrial policy is about fixing externalities. And I think it largely comes from recent crises. The carbon pollution and the rise of global warming has led to subsidies for solar, for wind power and clean energies, has led to regulatory approaches. The recent crises about supply chain resilience have policymakers pushing on vaccines and public health grounds and on national security grounds about semiconductors and things like that. The backdrop of these things is often the old saw of competitiveness. And that does rise in the theoretical, in the academic literature. If you start looking at industrial policy that's trying to promote greener energies, you immediately run into the question of, well, then should there be carbon content tariffs on the goods coming from countries where they won't go along with addressing the externality? And once you open the door to carbon content tariffs, you see that this is really just the old concern with the old industrial policy, that will that not be hijacked for purposes other than the most benign purposes, that we're trying to use the industrial policy to address a global externality of carbon. But if you open up carbon content tariffs, does that not open the door for other countries to claim national security interests or tariffs based on things that are not actually externalities? And in my view, that's really just reinventing what the old objections were. The same problems of the short-run orientation that was in the Stiglitz lecture pervades the problem of setting industrial policies, because the policymakers are attracted to whatever is the most recent as well. So if you look at just the COVID crisis, early in the COVID crisis, there would have been substantial industrial policy about ventilators. And it was only with a few months that we realized that building ventilators and having them domestically was not actually the most important aspect of dealing with COVID. That, in my view, is the old fear about information and the fear of failure. So category one is, in the new industrial policy, we've got to be mindful not to repeat the same mistakes of the old industrial policy. I think in category 1B, that's 1A, 1B, the places where industrial policy has had the most success in the new form have been those areas that have largely been non-political. So in the US context, the National Science Foundation, the National Institutes of Health, DARPA, the university funding system, that the government is providing grants that go to universities and investing in human capital, those basic research and applied research that the government does not object to the private sector kind of piggybacking on top of, have been extremely important for building up of critical industries. And that model applied to things like green energy, I think could be important, but it's the part that's important to realize, exactly what made that effective is not letting the designers of the industrial policy be the ones to decide what the money should go to. And in a sense, immigration is one of the ultimate new age industrial policies, letting in high human capital people and trying to attract them to come work in your country is industrial policy of the successful form. And then my second point is, the last 5 years have shown us it's going to be very hard to carry out the new type of industrial policy in an effective way, because the old bugaboos of nationalism just keep raising their head. So if you look at the last 5 years, the industrial policy wasn't about externalities. It was about just the old-fashioned, let's protect the US steel industry. Let's try to renegotiate NAFTA to get an advantage to US car manufacturers. Let's prop up small businesses. In the rescue money for COVID, the United States spent trillions of dollars, and far from giving the money in a non-political way, they went to the non-political actors like the central bank of industrial policy, like credit programs just for small business, credit programs that would just go through banks. We've had a whole lot of problems in that style, as well as large amounts of money to the airline industry, to the cruise industry, to politically connected industries. And the political aspects are more likely, I fear, to veer in the anti-immigrant, anti-Muslim, anti-foreign type of directions than they are to steer toward the externalities, which is where we want them to. So the rise of antitrust as an important area, but the hijacking of antitrust around the world into a nationalist direction of using antitrust laws to block out foreign goods rather than to try to improve innovation or lower prices, that's a cautionary tale. So my final statement is, this isn't your grandfather's industrial policy, but we must continue to struggle and balance to keep away from the dangers that your grandfather's industrial policy had.
Thank you very much, Dr. Goolsbee, for the wonderful presentation. Be mindful not to repeat the grandfather's failure in the new generation of industrial policy. Thank you very much. We took your message right, and thank you very much. And now we're going to listen to Professor Josh Rana.
Well, first of all, thank you very much for the invitation to speak here and the very interesting set of conversations. Very much have enjoyed it. And I'm going to spend a few minutes perhaps being a little bit more narrowly focused than some of the other talks, in the sense that I'm really going to focus on really a subset of industrial policies, right? We've talked about everything from, supply chain management, national defense. Austin has sort of broadened it out to include immigration policy. I'm really going to talk about some of the work that we've been doing, which has been on really industrial policies to focus on entrepreneurial businesses, or trying to encourage new ventures and growth. Clearly, there's been an enormous amount of activity along these lines around the world, even though, as we've acknowledged, it's only one manifestation of industrial policy. And it was sort of propitious that the Financial Times this morning highlighted some of the efforts that the Prime Minister is doing in terms of encouraging the GPIF, the Japanese government pension plan, the massive plan to shift their investments to more in Japanese startups, in the spirit of trying to promote new ventures and more dynamism in the Japanese economy. Our rough estimate is that if you look at the decade of 2010s and add up the amount of government programs government spending geared towards new ventures, it's roughly equivalent of what the private sector invested in this area. So really a huge sum of money. And we're less interested in debating whether this is good or bad per se, and more focusing on the relationship, the structure of these programs, what does and doesn't work, and with a particular emphasis on collaborations between these public entrepreneurial finance programs and the engagement with private markets. Now, you might say, why is this an interesting or important question? And I guess the place I would start is by just sort of talking a little bit about how hard investing in new ventures really is. We know that choosing these businesses have, all the kinds of information problems that we as economists, sort of take for granted in terms of information asymmetries and a lot of uncertainty. We know that a lot of the decisions that private venture capitalists make are really being driven by soft information. So very qualitative judgments. And one can imagine that this is hard to translate into a public sector setting. Another aspect is the sort of difficulty of providing governance to these companies and decisions around these investments. We know that in many cases, when companies do get public financing, they get financed again and again and again, even if the private venture capitalists tend to be quite brutal in cutting off most of the businesses that they fund. And again, we might imagine that this is just very difficult for a government to replicate for a variety of reasons. One of the key aspects, of course, is that private investors are compensated very differently than public investors, right? That it's certainly been very difficult with the few efforts that have been tried to compensate public officials along the lines of private investors with getting a substantial return there. That's generally led to a huge amount of blowback. And as a result, a point that, Daron Acemoglu, that Professor Stiglitz himself and others have made, is that if governments are smart, they think about these kinds of information problems that are out there and try to figure out ways to address it. And one might think that collaborating with the private sector is a way to do so. So we ask here just simply the question of, when is this kind of collaboration likely to be effective? And we do a very, sort of simple model that we borrow, where we just sort of hypothesize that governments care not just about private returns, but also about the externalities in a way that public investors don't, but that private investors don't, but private investors can bring stuff to the table in terms of improving the likelihood of success in a way that public investors don't. And we look at how things vary with quality and how effective the venture capitalists are, and whether there's how the extent to which rent seeking is a problem in these contexts. And we try to ask, when is this more likely? Now, what we do here empirically is a little different from much of the work that's been done. I think when you look at, most of the efforts to seriously evaluate public venture capital programs that have been published, at least in the economic literature, over the last decade or so, they've had the flavor often of sort of honing in on one particular program and exploiting some sort of discontinuity or cutoff or other thing. We as economists call this identification, right? And it's clearly identification is important. A lot of good identifiers got the Nobel Prize last year, all right? But in a way that can allow you to say some things, but there are many things you can't say. And in particular, thinking about some of these broader questions of when does the engagement with the private sector make sense and when doesn't it, is one of those areas where the sort of very narrow but precise look at a single program is unlikely to be able to help you. So we essentially tried to create as comprehensive a look as possible at the government programs to fund entrepreneurial businesses around the globe, essentially 750 programs over 25 years in 65 countries. And we try to do a variety of testing just to sort of give a sense of where the money is during this 95 to 2019 program. Most of the places where the money, with big money is deep red, right, is the big countries, which isn't really that surprising. Those are the people who have wealth. Perhaps a little more interesting to look at it as a share of GDP, and where you see some of the smaller places, the Canadians, the Finns, the Turks, and the like, having more substantial investments in this area. Just to give a sense of what we find, and maybe this will give some food for thought. By and large, we do see things which are pretty consistent with our framework, that when governments are more effective, they're more likely to go and involve the private sector. When the information problems are greater, so for instance, in a context when the government is trying to help earlier stage or startup businesses rather than more mature companies, there's greater involvement in the private activity. And it seems like it very much builds off the existing presence of private venturing, that there seems to be the willingness of governments to reach out to the private sector as a function of the extent to which the ventures sector is more established. Perhaps more interesting is some of the evidence that we see around the consequences of these programs. So here we look at essentially what we have in the left-hand side, the little graph, is the normalized number of important patents generated in the given country around the time of the inception of one of these programs. And what one does see is there does seem to be a development of a bit of a discontinuity or a jump up around these programs. If you look more narrowly at patents by young firms, for instance, one sees this pattern even more strongly. So it does give some degree of optimism that these programs can work, and that in particular, thinking carefully about the design of these things and the engagement with the public sector is really critical. So thanks so much for your attention and for the invitation to come here.
Thank you very much, Dr. Rana, for the very interesting presentation based on the literature in the field of startup program and the collaboration between the government and the private sector. Thank you very much. Now we're going to invite the discussant. First, Dr. Tomiura Eiichi, Professor of Hitotsubashi University.
Okay, thank you for having me here. The government official is supposed to appear as a discussant in this session, but I'm now in academia. But when I was young, I spent several years in the Industrial Policy Bureau Ministry in the early 1980s, so I like to comment on the presentation. But I have no clear objection against the presentation, so I refer to my own research to strengthen the point and then add my own remark. Okay, Professor Goolsbee emphasized the risk of old industry policy, the ghost of grandpa. And on the old industry policy, my personal experience is I was deeply impressed by the Professor Goolsbee's classic paper published in the year 1998, pointing out the unintended hidden cost of R&D subsidy. And my personal research also find a similar finding in the case of industrial relocation policy in Japan. That policy was successful in relocating manufacturing plants from the urban core to periphery, but the unintended consequence of this policy was widening core urban gap in productivity. So we need to evaluate industrial policy, including the effect on unintended outcome. And then next, I agree with Professor Rana on the importance of private capital in industrial policy. And my own research cited here also confirmed that the industrial, in this case, the industrial cluster policy project in Japan was successful only if the local bank are involved as the main bank. So industrial policy cannot be successful without commitment of financial sector. I think these points echoed what was raised in the previous session, and especially serious in the new form of industrial policy. And I'd like to add my own words on new industrial policy. In the old industrial policy, the policy target was simple, and the volume production, export value, or number of workers in the target industry. But in the new policy, targets are often multidimensional: resilience, innovativeness, intangibles. And the policy tools are simple in the old age, tax break, subsidy, tariff. But now the policy tools are indirect or soft, facilitation, non-tariff barriers. All these are hard to measure. So we face fundamental measurement problem. And we also have a very strict standard for policy evaluation, especially in the identification of causality. And in the case of industrial policy, randomization is practically impossible. So we need high quality data for policy evaluation. These are challenges for new industrial policy, but I think we have a good news too, that the high frequency big data are accumulated in private sector. And we also know that research development in urban or regional economics on place-based policy provide us excellent research result in designing identification. So it is important for us to design a data collection scheme in advance before the start of policy project for policy evaluation in the future. Without such forward-looking data collection efforts, policy evaluation will end up with inconclusive results due to insufficient data. I heard that Japan's RIETI is planning such a trial. I expect further collaboration among government, industry, and academia for data collection in this direction. Thank you.
Thank you very much, Dr. Tomiura. You had a new perspective on the evaluation of new industrial policy and the importance of data collection and data design. Thank you very much. Now we're going to listen to Dr. Philip Steinbeck from Federal Ministry of Germany.
Yeah, thank you so much. Thank you for having me and for this highly interesting discussion. For the sake of clarity, I will be brief and maybe a little bit provocative. So I basically have 4 points. My first point, and I mean, this is what most of the interventions made very clear. It's not about if we need industrial policy, but what kind of industrial policy. So in a way, this is almost trivial. However, I mean, only like a couple of years ago, my predecessor, his main task was actually to erase every word of industrial policy from documents and from policy programs here. So, I mean, we have seen quite an important important change here, and that is good. I think, and this has, this has been made quite clear in this conference and in many papers. There are a lot of good justifications for industrial policy based on modern interpretations of market failures. And we have heard a few of these, starting with Joe Stiglitz in a couple of hours ago. Obviously, we have the question of externalities that has been mentioned quite a few times already. I would stretch it a little bit further, actually, and not only talk about externalities, but of planetary boundaries. So that is basically, externalities is good. If you internalize them, then you can kind of justify everything. We would go a little bit further and say it's about planetary boundaries, because you cannot just do everything on this planet. And then obviously, in terms of industrial policy, you talk about decarbonization programs and all kinds of climate mitigation policies. Second, that hasn't been mentioned so often, obviously, is network effects. We have huge network effects in this digital economy. We have positive spillover effects using digital infrastructure, but obviously difficulties to split the costs. And here, once again, industrial policy can help with a lot of instruments. It's obviously instruments which have direct support elements, but also indirect policy measures like cutting red tape and tax measures and so on. In a third market failure has been mentioned by Josh and others. Obviously, it's capital market failure. We have finance instruments where the state plays a role, and I would absolutely concur that we need private investors as well, who help us actually calibrate the instruments, and we do this. I'm the head of the German support fund, the Economic Stabilization Fund, and we do work a lot together with private investors in order actually to find the right framework and the right design of our measures. Then we have path dependency, of course, especially in the digitalized economy. And here, and that what hasn't mentioned so much is of course competition policy. I think competition policy goes hand in hand with industrial policy, needs to do this. I think this is something Philippe Aguillon makes quite clear, and this is something we try to actually put into practice as well. Because this is important. But then there are other projects in Europe. We are setting up a European hyperscaler we call Gaia X, which actually tries to help businesses to connect together in order to set up this hyperscaler and overcome path dependencies. So this is more or less, you can discuss it, but I think there's a lot of agreement in these times today. But what hasn't been mentioned so much, and when Austin talks about we have this new generation industrial policy, I think it's those, let's say, classical justifications of market failures newly interpreted. I think there's a lot of agreement. But then, at least in Europe, but I would argue in the whole world, there's another reason for industrial policy, which is very, very predominant, I would even call it. And that's something we call strategic autonomy or resilience or even independence. And I think this is quite important. Like now we are in the third year of crisis, 2-year Corona crisis, 1 year of Ukraine war crisis. And I mean, like my government, and I think in the United States as well, in many other countries, is a lot about the concept of strategic autonomy. We are trying to support semiconductors, chip industries, and with a lot of money, we are trying to relocate value chains into our countries. And because we say we need to become resilient, because like the international distribution of work, like the classical Philip assumption doesn't work anymore. And I think there is a point to it, but there's a danger to it, of course. And this leads me to my third point. That is, I mean, having said yes, we need modern industrial policy, like Austin said, new generation industrial policy. And there are new reasons motivating industrial policy, especially strategic autonomy. But what is like for a policy maker or policy advisor like me, what is really difficult to say is, so how to determine the right instruments, how to pick the right instruments, and how to calibrate all those instruments. This is really, I think, the main challenge. And if you agree, like with Matsukato and many of the participants of this conference, that we need the state back in, and I'm in with that as well. It's a bit difficult, to calibrate all those different instruments in order to trying to do like modern industrial policy. And here, like, I think I would like to hear a little bit more how this can be done, not that we need modern industrial policy. What kind of modern industrial policy, and what are the instruments, and what are the ways to determine like the instruments? This is really, like, once again, for a practitioner like me, this is the challenge, because my department colleagues, they all come up with brilliant ideas, totally justified, because there are market failures. They tell me, okay, we need this program to support decarbonization, we need this measure, and so on, and how to find the right mix. I think this is key, and here I am. Maybe we can touch on that in the. My last point is basically on notions. There's industrial policy is tremendously successful as a concept and in practice. So, but where do we delimit it? Is everything industrial policy, which has to do with market failure or a state intervention? Is this it? In Germany, we have a slightly more narrow concept, which maybe helps us to become more clear. But I'm a bit skeptical. But I understand Austin Wasby's point that like industrial policy, as he called it, is successful when it's non-political, like mentioning the science example. On the other hand, I mean, all the areas we have to deal with, they are highly political. So I'm afraid we won't succeed to become apolitical. I think industrial policy is something very political, and we need to deal with it. And we need to not only decide if we need to do industrial policy, but what kind of industrial policy, and what are our prompters, what are the criteria for industrial policy. Thank you very much.
Thank you very much, Dr. Steinbeck, for stimulate discussion. And before going to the discussion, we have a question from Professor Roderick. First to Professor Rana. Can you say a bit more about what private sector involvement means in practice of these programs? That is a question to Dr. Rana.
So I guess the way that I like to think about it is that when you have a situation where the government has funding on the one hand and there are entrepreneurs on the other, the more distance you can put between the government officials and the entrepreneurs, usually it's the better. And in particular, that I like to see or encourage people to use mechanisms such as that by the very successful Israeli program Yozma, where the government gave money to intermediaries, to venture capital funds, rather than directly to entrepreneurs. I think that can lead to better sorting. I think that, in a way, there's often, it often seems to be important to have an element of matching funds involved as well. So if you think about the Yozma example, they used essentially for every 60 cents that the venture capitalist put in, the government put in 40 cents. And essentially, the idea was that the public funds, were validated by receiving private capital, which could, in some sense, if the public investors weren't able to get matching funds, it probably wasn't that good an investment. And, I think that there are a variety of tricks that people can use, like trying to, give more of the upside to the private sector to try to encourage it. But I think the main key notions are really this notion of, give it to people who are somewhat independent, and then, to make their own decisions and to provide, some sort of matching to have validation for the public funding. Thank you.
Thank you, Dr. Rana. And the second question is already answered by Dr. Austin about Dr. Goolsbee. The question was how to avoid the capture problem in the program, but Dr. Austin already answered that the peer review may work in their own program. So now let's turn into the discussion on Q&A, and turning back to the Dr. Steinbeck's presentation. He, as a practitioner of the industrial policy, and he also brought the European perspective of strategic autonomy and resilience of value chains. And his issue is how to policy right, put instrument right. So if Professor Kursby or Professor Rana has any answer to the issues raised by Dr. Steinbeck, we would like to listen to your perspective.
Yeah, I thought two things. One, I think there was an insight that Dr. Steinbeck raised, I would kind of characterize as the conflicting objectives, and the fact that, so think of the Josh Lerner approach of the tricks that can separate the political from the entrepreneurs, involve things like they're matching funds, they have to go through an intermediary. In the US context of the COVID rescue, we designed just such a policy to be run through the Fed. They wanted to rapidly fund small businesses to prevent them from failing. So they ran it through intermediaries of the banks. But that's not without controversy, because of course that meant that the banks favored the banks first gave the money to their most favored clients. And their most favored clients tend to be very high income entrepreneurs. And we got into conflicting objectives. And the more political, I think Dr. Steinbeck's right, that everything does involve politics. But I guess my only point is that's the hardest part about it. Once everything involves politics, it's going to be prone to get pulled back into the morass that was the previous industrial policy. And his acknowledgement that autonomy, what he calls autonomy, is a big motivator, that doesn't feel different than the previous industrial policy. I think that is the previous industrial policy. That's the kind of fueled by competitiveness, and we don't like foreign things. We want to be able to do it all at home. There is a danger of going too far that way.
Can I just build on Austin's comment for a moment, if I may? I think that certainly one of the important aspects is to make sure that the intermediaries can have real financial stakes at it, right? When you think about, the payroll protection program in the United States, in many senses, right, the banks were, basically collecting lots of fees for administrating the money, but he had no real element of, beyond that, evaluation or link to performance. I think that when you look at, some of the more successful efforts, the government has sort of pushed the private sector to basically putting their own money in and their own money at risk. I'm not comfortable with the programs that just provide some sort of guarantee to the venture capitalists or the other intermediaries saying you can't lose money, the government will just make up for any kind of losses you have. Rather, you really want that kind of alignment of incentives to try to, as much as one can, depoliticize the investment decision and make it much more linked to economic considerations.
Thank you very much. Dr. Steinbeck, you have any further comments on the comments by two speakers?
Yeah, I mean, if I just can come back, I mean, I would agree with Boston Goolsby that probably like the motivation of industrial policy was like first generation industrial policy was very much national in a way as well. That is probably true. I think what is different now, and this is that we have a different narrative and we have a different story to tell, and we need different answers, because I mean I do believe that the answer cannot be purely renationalization and like a race to ever more subsidies, like what we are doing now in the chips semiconductor businesses, just handing out huge checks in order to attract the high-tech companies. I think that cannot do the trick. Therefore, what we are at least trying to do in order to at least mitigate that is, in Europe we have this concept which is called important projects of common European interest. That means at least we have to team up with different states in Europe with a high R&D content. And only if we do that, and if the European Commission clears that, then we are allowed to subsidize that. So I think this is one possibility. And then obviously there are different agreements how to actually strengthen the resilience and strategic autonomy, which doesn't necessarily only have to be renationalization. So this is basically, I mean, I agree that you can say at the end it boils down to similar things, but I think it is important. It is important that you are aware that the justifications are changing, necessities are changing, but the answers don't have to be the same like in the first generation policies. This is I think my main point.
Thank you very much. 30 seconds left, and Dr. Tomura mentioned about forward-looking policy evaluation. If anyone has any comment on that?
Sorry,
I just would say it's very hard to look in the crystal ball and predict what technologies are going to be the most important, right? But there's been many examples of governments trying to predict where the technologies are going to go, and most of them have been pretty mixed. So I think that in many senses, you know, trying to do more to sort of set the table and set the broad parameters for entrepreneurship to try to push it over rather than, you know, essentially trying to dictate where technologies are going to go is a humbler but more likely to be successful kind of approach. Thank you.
Thank you very much for your comment. And so thank you everyone for participating and contributing. And now the session is closed.
Thanks for having me. Goodbye.
Thank you very much.
Thank you.
Thank you.
Thank you very much for all panelists and chairs for session 1 and session 2. And now we would like to take a 5 minutes break. We will resume the conference at 2:56 p.m. GMT.